7 years ago, my own sister, Kaitlyn, didn't just betray me, she meticulously dismantled my life and married my high society fiancé, Barrett, while the ink on our wedding invitations was barely dry. As they stood at the altar, my relatives whispered that I had lost everything, pitying the woman who was forced to flee Savannah with nothing but a shattered reputation. I stayed quiet for 7 long years, retreating to the shadows of Manhattan, pretending the humiliation hadn't fundamentally broken me. But today, standing under the weeping willows of our family estate for my mother's burial, the silence ends. Kaitlyn sashayed toward me, flaunting a diamond larger than her conscience and a smug grin that screamed victory, clearly expecting me to wither in her shadow once again. She leaned in, her voice a poisonous honey as she bragged about her mansion, her status, and the man she stole, mockingly asking if I was still struggling to get by alone. I didn't cry, and I didn't look away. Instead, I let a calm, terrifying smile spread across my face as I signaled toward the black luxury sedan pulling up behind us. "Oh, Kaitlyn," I replied, my voice steady enough to chill the Georgia air. "You've spent 7 years bragging about having it all, but tell me, have you actually met my husband yet?" The look of pure, unadulterated horror on her face when she realized exactly who I had married was worth every second of my patient, silent wait for justice. Before I reveal the shocking truth that sent my sister's perfect world into a tailspin, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss a single second of how I finally turned the tables on the people who thought they could destroy me. 10 years ago, the cobblestone streets of Savannah felt like they belonged entirely to me. I was the lead art appraiser at the city's most prestigious auction house, a position I had earned through ruthless dedication and a sharp eye for hidden value. My life was a synchronized dance of high-stakes galas and private viewings for Georgia's elite. At the center of that whirlwind was Barrett Miller, a man whose reputation as a rising real estate developer was only matched by his calculated charm. When we first met at a fundraiser for the historic district, he didn't just ask for my name. He spent 45 minutes discussing the brushwork of an obscure 19th century portrait I was standing near. Barrett had a way of making you feel like the only person in a room of 500, and within 6 months, we were the city's it couple. He bought me a vintage sapphire ring that cost $65,000 and promised me a future that felt as solid as the Victorian architecture surrounding us. My mother, Eleanor, adored him, often remarking that Barrett was the anchor I needed to balance my ambitious spirit. We were planning a wedding that the local social registries were already calling the event of the decade. Everything seemed impenetrable until my younger sister, Kaitlyn, reappeared on our doorstep like a storm cloud on a summer afternoon. Kaitlyn had always been the volatile one in the family, a woman who treated life like a stage where she was the perpetual, misunderstood lead. She arrived with a designer suitcase and a tearful story about a failed business venture in Los Angeles that had supposedly left her with $0 in her bank account. She claimed she had been evicted from her apartment and had nowhere else to turn. Against my better judgment, but urged by Eleanor's soft heart, I opened the doors of my meticulously decorated home to her. Kaitlyn walked into my living room, her eyes darting across the expensive art on my walls, and sighed about how lucky I was to have found a man like Barrett. I didn't see the envy then. I only saw a sister who needed a place to land. Barrett was initially hesitant about the arrangement, noting that our privacy was paramount during the final stages of our engagement. However, Kaitlyn quickly made herself indispensable. She would have dinner waiting when we returned from late-night events, and volunteered to handle the tedious logistics of our wedding guest list. I remember the first time I felt a flicker of unease. We were sitting on the veranda of my house, sipping bourbon and watching the sunset, when Kaitlyn mentioned that she had spent the afternoon helping Barrett scout locations for his new luxury hotel project. She laughed, touching his forearm lightly, and remarked that they shared the exact same taste in modern aesthetics. Barrett didn't pull away. He just laughed along and offered her his glass to try the drink. It was a small, seemingly insignificant gesture, but it felt like a cold breeze had suddenly passed through the humid Georgia air. I pushed the feeling aside, telling myself that I was being paranoid and that I should be happy my fiancé and my sister were finally getting along. I had no idea that while I was busy appraising the value of dead artists' legacies, Kaitlyn was already appraising the value of the life I had built, waiting for the perfect moment to claim it for herself. Weeks turned into months, and the subtle shift in the atmosphere of my home became a constant, nagging pressure behind my eyes. Kaitlyn didn't just occupy the guest suite. She began to bleed into the very fabric of my daily routine with Barrett. I would return from a high-stakes auction at 7 in the evening, exhausted from hours of negotiating prices for French Impressionist landscapes, only to find the two of them already deep in conversation over a bottle of vintage Cabernet. They didn't stop when I entered the kitchen. They simply adjusted their posture, their laughter lingering in the air like a scent I couldn't quite identify. Kaitlyn had started wearing my clothes, claiming she forgot to do her laundry, and she looked disturbingly comfortable in my silk emerald blouse that Barrett had always admired. When I mentioned it, she would just pout and say that we were sisters and that sharing was what family did. Barrett would often chime in, telling me I was being too rigid and that he enjoyed the vibrant energy Kaitlyn brought to the house. The unease deepened when I noticed the disappearance of several small but significant items from my private collection. A set of gold cufflinks worth $4,000 that I had bought for Barrett's birthday vanished from his dresser, and a small charcoal sketch by a local artist was missing from the hallway. When I questioned Kaitlyn, she widened her eyes in feigned innocence, suggesting that perhaps the cleaning crew had misplaced them. Barrett, strangely, didn't seem concerned at all, brushing it off as a minor loss that his insurance would eventually cover. It wasn't just the objects. It was the way Barrett started looking at me, or rather, the way he stopped looking at me. His once attentive gaze was now frequently fixed on his phone, his thumb flicking rapidly through messages that he never bothered to share. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, I decided to leave the office early to surprise Barrett with a private lunch. As I pulled my car into the driveway of our Savannah estate, I saw his silver SUV parked crookedly near the entrance. I walked through the heavy oak doors, my heels clicking softly on the marble, and heard a muffled sound coming from the library. It wasn't the sound of a business meeting. It was the unmistakable, low murmur of a woman's voice followed by Barrett's deep, rumbling chuckle. I stood in the foyer, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. When I pushed open the library door, I found Kaitlyn sitting on the edge of the mahogany desk, her legs swinging casually while she held one of my expensive art catalogs. Barrett was leaning over her, his hand resting dangerously close to her knee as he pointed at a specific painting. They both jumped slightly when they saw me, but the guilt I expected was absent. Instead, Barrett straightened his tie and remarked that they were just discussing the aesthetic value of the new collection for his hotel lobby. Kaitlyn hopped off the desk, smoothing out the skirt of a dress that looked suspiciously like the one I had planned to wear for our rehearsal dinner. She blew me a kiss and walked out, leaving a thick trail of her floral perfume behind. Later that night, as I prepared for bed, I found a single, long blonde hair on Barrett's side of the pillow, a shade that was distinctly Kaitlyn's, not mine. When I confronted him, he laughed and said she must have been helping him move some boxes earlier that day. His tone was dismissive, almost mocking, as if I were a child imagining monsters in the dark. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, realizing that the man I was supposed to marry and the sister I had tried to save were weaving a web of lies right under my nose, and the wedding I had dreamt of was starting to look like a funeral for my dignity. 3 weeks before our scheduled wedding, I decided to stop playing the role of the unsuspecting victim and finally confront the shadow haunting my home. Barrett had recently purchased a luxury penthouse overlooking the Savannah River, a sanctuary he claimed would be our first real home as a married couple. He told me the interior designers were still finishing the master suite and strictly forbade me from visiting until the grand reveal. That Friday afternoon, however, I ignored his warnings. I had spent $12,000 on a rare, early 20th century landscape painting as a surprise housewarming gift, and I wanted to see exactly where it would hang. I drove to the construction site, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The silence of the car feeling heavier than the humid Georgia air. The elevator ride to the top floor felt like an eternity, the mechanical hum echoing the frantic beating of my heart. When the doors slid open, the scent hit me first, not the smell of fresh paint or expensive sawdust, but the heavy, floral aroma of Kaitlyn's signature perfume. I walked through the open concept living area, my footsteps silenced by the thick, cream-colored carpets that had cost $20,000 alone. I followed the sound of muffled music and laughter coming from the master bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, casting a sliver of golden light onto the hallway floor. As I pushed it open, the air left my lungs in a sharp, painful gasp. There was Barrett, leaning against the velvet headboard of our new bed, a glass of champagne in his hand and a look of pure adoration on his face. But it was Kaitlyn who shattered my soul. She was standing in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror, twirling slowly while wearing my custom-made, hand-stitched silk wedding gown, the one I had spent 6 months designing with a boutique in Paris. She had even pinned my grandmother's vintage lace veil into her blonde hair. "Do you think she'll notice if I wear this for the rehearsal?" Kaitlyn giggled, her voice dripping with a casual malice that made my skin crawl. Barrett laughed, pulling her toward him by the waist of my dress, his fingers brushing against the delicate lace I had chosen for my special day. "She's too busy with her dusty old paintings to notice anything, babe," he murmured, his lips pressing against her neck. "In 3 weeks, you'll have the ring, the house, and the man, just like we planned." I didn't scream. I didn't rush in to tear the dress off her back or throw the champagne in Barrett's face. Instead, a terrifying, icy clarity washed over me, a feeling of detachment so profound that it felt like I was watching a scene from someone else's tragic play. I stepped into the room, my shadow falling across the mirror, and watched the color drain from their faces in unison. The silence that followed was deafening. Kaitlyn froze, her hand still clutching the silk skirt of my gown, while Barrett spilled his drink across the white duvet. "Sloane, it's not what it looks like," he stammered. The same pathetic lie I had heard 1,000 times before. I looked at the man I had intended to spend my life with, and then at the sister I had shared a childhood with. and realized they were both strangers to me. I reached into my purse, pulled out the sapphire engagement ring, and placed it calmly on the bedside table. "Keep the dress, Kaitlyn," I said, my voice as cold and sharp as a scalpel. It was always meant for someone far cheaper than me. I turned and walked out of the penthouse, leaving the landscape painting leaning against the wall, a final, expensive gift for a life I was officially leaving behind. The humid, heavy air of Georgia felt like a noose I had finally managed to slip over my head. I didn't wait for the morning sun to reveal the wreckage of my engagement. Instead, I packed 2 suitcases with my most essential belongings and drove north before the clock struck midnight. I left my keys on the kitchen island and my dignity intact, refusing to answer the dozens of frantic texts from Barrett or the sobbing, manipulative voicemails from Kaitlyn. By the time I crossed the state line into South Carolina, I had already contacted a broker in Manhattan to secure a tiny, overpriced studio apartment in Chelsea. I traded my sprawling family estate and my high society reputation for 500 square feet of chipped paint and the relentless, anonymous roar of the city. For the first 6 months, my life was a blur of exhausting subway rides and low-level freelance appraisal gigs that barely covered my $4,000 monthly rent. The betrayal from my family hurt far worse than the loss of a man I clearly never knew. When I called Eleanor, hoping for a shred of maternal comfort, she simply sighed and told me I was being dramatic for abandoning my sister during her pregnancy, a pregnancy I hadn't even known about until that devastating phone call. My father, Arthur, was even colder, suggesting that if I hadn't been so obsessed with my career, perhaps Barrett wouldn't have looked elsewhere. I was effectively dead to them, a ghost haunting the edges of their new, perfect family portrait. I spent my nights staring at the flickering neon lights outside my window, fueled by a cold, simmering rage that eventually crystallized into a singular purpose. I was going to build a life so formidable that they wouldn't even be able to look me in the eye. My breakthrough came a year later at a high-profile auction, involving a disputed collection of post-war European art. I was representing a small, private gallery when I noticed a subtle discrepancy in the provenance of a centerpiece painting. While the rest of the room was prepared to bid millions, I stood up and calmly presented evidence that the work was a sophisticated forgery. The room went silent, but one man in the front row didn't look annoyed. He looked intrigued. That was the first time I saw Reese Montgomery. He was the founding partner of Montgomery and Associates, the most feared litigation firm in New York, a man known for dismantling empires with a single cross-examination. Reese didn't approach me with a pickup line. He handed me his card and told me that his firm needed an art consultant with my specific brand of lethal integrity. Reese was a man of few words and immense power, with a presence that commanded the air around him. Working for him wasn't just a job, it was an education in strategic warfare. He taught me that justice wasn't something you waited for. It was something you engineered. As we spent long nights in his glass-walled office overlooking Central Park, our professional relationship slowly shifted into something deeper and more profound. Reese saw the scars I carried not as weaknesses, but as armor. He was the first person to truly understand that my silence over the last few years wasn't a sign of defeat, but a period of silent accumulation. We were married 2 years after we met. A private ceremony in a quiet courthouse that cost us only $50 for the license, a stark contrast to the $100,000 wedding Barrett had planned as a performance. Reese didn't just give me his name. He gave me the resources to finally return to Savannah and settle the debt that had been accruing interest for 7 long years. Marriage to Reese wasn't just a union of hearts. It was a strategic alliance that gave me access to the kind of information that destroys empires. While Kaitlyn was busy posting filtered photos of her blessed life in Savannah, I was sitting in our library in Manhattan, dissecting the forensic accounting reports Reese's firm had pulled on Barrett Miller's real estate holdings. The truth was far uglier than the polished facade they presented to our hometown. Barrett's luxury hotel project, the one he had used as an excuse to spend so much time with Kaitlyn, had become a financial black hole. He had overleveraged his assets, taking out predatory loans totaling nearly $15 million to keep his company afloat. He wasn't the successful mogul everyone thought he was. He was a man drowning in debt, desperately clawing at anything to stay above water. The most heartbreaking discovery, however, concerned my mother's estate. Reese's investigators found a series of suspicious wire transfers from Eleanor's private trust, amounting to over $800,000 over the last 3 years. The signatures on the authorization forms were shaky, inconsistent imitations of my mother's elegant script. Kaitlyn hadn't just stolen my fiancé. She was systematically draining our mother's life savings while Eleanor's health declined. It became clear that Kaitlyn was funding their extravagant lifestyle, the designer clothes, the country club memberships, and the upkeep of that stolen penthouse using money that was legally intended for my mother's long-term medical care. Every time I looked at the digital copies of those forged documents, my blood ran cold with a focused, icy resolve. I spent months working alongside Mr. Whitaker, the loyal butler who had served my family for 30 years and who had been quietly sidelined by Kaitlyn. Through encrypted emails, he provided me with time-stamped accounts of Kaitlyn's neglect and the way she had isolated Eleanor from anyone who might question the sudden gifts she was receiving. He told me how Kaitlyn would scream at my mother behind closed doors, demanding she sign papers in exchange for basic attention. The rage I felt was no longer the hot, impulsive fire of a betrayed bride. It was the cold, calculating precision of an apex predator. I wasn't just going back for an apology. I was going back to reclaim a legacy that was being dismantled by a narcissist and a fraud. Rhys watched me during those long nights, his hand resting supportively on my shoulder, as we reviewed the final legal dossiers. He had already quietly purchased the distressed debt on Barrett's primary commercial properties through one of his shell companies, effectively becoming his rival's secret landlord. We held all the cards, but Rhys cautioned me to wait for the right moment, the moment when the entire family would be gathered, and the impact would be maximum. That opportunity arrived with the devastating news of Eleanor's passing. While my heart broke for the mother I hadn't been allowed to say goodbye to, a different part of me knew that the stage was finally set. We prepared our return to Georgia not as mourners seeking forgiveness, but as the architects of a long overdue reckoning. I packed a single black suit that had cost $5,000, a garment that felt more like a suit of armor than funeral attire, ready to finally show my sister the true cost of her betrayal. The humid air of Savannah felt like a suffocating blanket as I stood by the open grave of my mother, Eleanor. The cemetery was filled with the familiar faces of Georgia's elite people who had whispered behind my back for 7 years, branding me the scorned woman who ran away with her tail between her legs. I felt their judgment like a physical weight, their eyes scanning my simple but impeccably tailored black suit for any sign of the poverty they assumed I lived in. Then, the silence was shattered by the rhythmic clicking of stiletto heels on the stone path. Kaitlyn arrived late, draped in a dramatic lace veil that looked more like a costume than an expression of grief. She was clinging to Barrett's arm, and he looked older, his face etched with a desperate kind of stress that his expensive silk tie couldn't quite hide. As the service ended, the guests began to mingle, and Kaitlyn made a direct line for me, her eyes gleaming with a malicious triumph. She didn't offer a hug or a word of shared sorrow for the mother we had both lost. Instead, she adjusted the 5-carat diamond ring on her finger, the one I knew was likely a high-quality cubic zirconia, and smirked. "Sloane, darling, I'm so surprised you showed up," she said, her voice loud enough to catch the attention of a nearby group of aunts. "We all thought you'd be too embarrassed to face us, especially considering your current circumstances. It must be so difficult, living in a cramped apartment in the city while we've been maintaining the family legacy here." Barrett stood behind her, nodding awkwardly, unable to even meet my gaze. He looked like a man who was terrified of his own shadow, let alone the woman he had betrayed. Our relatives leaned in, their faces twisted into masks of fake sympathy. One of my cousins remarked how brave I was to return without a husband or a career to speak of, effectively echoing the lies Kaitlyn had been feeding them for years. Kaitlyn laughed, a sharp, grating sound that felt like a sacrilege in the quiet of the graveyard. "Don't be too hard on her," she cooed, touching my shoulder with a condescending pat. "Not everyone is meant for the high-pressure life of the Miller family. If you need a job, Sloane, I'm sure Barrett could find a position for you as a receptionist at one of his hotels. It would certainly pay better than whatever little art projects you've been doing." She was so convinced of her victory, so certain that I was still the broken girl who had fled in the middle of the night, that she didn't notice the way I was looking at her, not with anger, but with a profound, chilling pity. I took a slow, deliberate step toward her, forcing her to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. The air between us seemed to freeze. "You've spent 7 years building a throne out of stolen bricks, Kaitlyn," I said, my voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of a gavel. "You honestly think I came back here because I missed the gossip of this small, narrow-minded town? You've spent so much time looking down at me that you've completely failed to see who is standing right behind you." As if on cue, a long, black luxury sedan pulled up to the edge of the cemetery path, and the crowd gasped as a man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit stepped out. It was Rhys, and the way the sunlight caught the crest of his law firm on his briefcase made the color drain from Barrett's face instantly. I didn't look at the car. I kept my eyes locked on Kaitlyn's as her smug expression began to crumble into a mask of pure, unadulterated confusion. Rhys walked across the manicured grass with the kind of deliberate, measured stride that usually preceded $1 million settlement in a Manhattan courtroom. The whispers of my relatives died in their throats as they took in his tailored charcoal suit and the unmistakable aura of authority that surrounded him. He didn't look at the crowd. His eyes were fixed solely on me, softening for a fraction of a second before he turned a gaze as cold as a winter morning on Barrett. "Sloane, I apologize for the delay," Rhys said, his voice resonating through the cemetery like a low roll of thunder. "The filing for the receivership of Miller Developments took slightly longer than anticipated." Barrett's face, already pale, turned a sickly shade of gray. He stepped back, his hand trembling as he recognized the man who had been systematically dismantling his real estate empire from 3 states away. Kaitlyn, however, was still clinging to her delusion, her voice rising in a shrill, panicked octave. "Who do you think you are, interrupting our mother's funeral with this nonsense?" she demanded, pointing a manicured finger at Rhys. Barrett is the most successful developer in Savannah. We don't need your filings or your presence here. Reese didn't even flinch. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a single, crimson-bound legal folder. Actually, Kaitlyn, Barrett is currently $400,000 behind on his interest payments to a holding company I happen to own. Reese replied with a terrifyingly calm smile. As of 9 o'clock this morning, every property you've been bragging about, including the penthouse where you tried on Sloane's wedding dress, is legally under my control. You are essentially trespassing on my husband's assets. The gasp that went through the crowd was audible, but I wasn't finished. I stepped forward, signaling to a figure standing near the stone gates of the estate. Mr. Whitaker, our loyal butler, walked toward us, holding a digital tablet that looked starkly modern against the backdrop of the historic cemetery. The money wasn't enough for you, was it, Kaitlyn? I asked, my voice cutting through her frantic denials. You had to drain Eleanor's trust too. I took the tablet from Mr. Whitaker and pressed play on a video recorded 6 months before my mother's death. The screen showed Kaitlyn screaming at a frail, confused Eleanor, forcing her to sign blank checks in exchange for her heart medication. The relatives who had been sneering at me moments ago now recoiled in horror as they witnessed the true nature of the devoted daughter. Those signatures you forged amounted to $850,000, I continued, staring into Kaitlyn's wide, terrified eyes. But you were too arrogant to realize that Mr. Whitaker had installed security cameras for my mother's protection long ago. He's been sending me the footage for years. Barrett looked like he was about to vomit, his knees buckling under the weight of his mounting debt and public disgrace. Kaitlyn tried to lunge toward the tablet, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage, but Reese stepped firmly between us. Don't, he warned, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. The police are already waiting at the entrance of the estate to discuss the elderly abuse and financial fraud charges. You've spent 7 years playing a queen, Kaitlyn, but the theater is officially closed. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of the wind through the weeping willows, as the family that had once shunned me began to realize they had bet on the wrong sister. The sound of gravel crunching under tires signaled the arrival of the Savannah Police Department, their blue and red lights reflecting off the polished marble of the nearby headstones. Kaitlyn's screams of "It's all lies" were quickly drowned out as 2 officers approached her, their faces grim and professional. They didn't care about her designer veil or her social standing. They only cared about the felony warrants for elder financial abuse and grand larceny that Reese had spent months preparing with the district attorney. As the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, the 5-carat ring she had flaunted so proudly looked like a pathetic shackle. She turned her desperate, tear-streaked face toward me, begging for help in a voice that finally sounded like the terrified child she had always hidden behind her cruelty. I didn't feel the surge of joy I expected, only a profound sense of relief that the poison was finally being drained from my life. Barrett was a ghost of a man, leaning against a weeping willow as he watched his wife being led away. His empire was gone, his reputation was in tatters, and he was facing a federal investigation into his fraudulent loan applications. He tried to speak to me, his lips trembling as he reached out a hand. But Reese stepped in front of me with a cold, protective finality. We didn't need to say a word. The legal documents already spoke for him. Barrett was left standing in the rain, a man who had traded a woman of substance for a shallow imitation, only to realize he was now left with nothing but a mountain of debt. Our relatives, seeing the tide had turned, rushed toward me with fake smiles and hollow apologies. They suddenly remembered how special I was, and how much Eleanor had loved me. My aunt reached for my hand, whispering about how we should all have dinner to heal the family, but I pulled back before she could touch me. The family died 7 years ago, I said, my voice quiet but echoing in the sudden silence of the cemetery. You all watched me leave with nothing and cheered for the woman who stole my life. Don't pretend you're happy for me now just because my husband has a bigger bank account than yours. I looked at the grave of my mother one last time, promising her that I would use her remaining estate to fund a foundation for elderly protection, something Kaitlyn would never be able to touch. Reese took my hand, his grip warm and solid, as he guided me toward the car. We didn't look back at the chaos at the cemetery gates or the flashing lights of the police cruisers. As we drove away from Savannah, the Spanish moss and the stifling traditions of my past faded into the rearview mirror. I had spent 7 years in a self-imposed exile, waiting for the moment I could finally speak my truth. I had learned that the best revenge isn't just living well. It's building a life so unshakable that the people who tried to break you become nothing more than a footnote in your history. My sister had married the man I was supposed to marry, and she had stolen the life I was supposed to lead. But in the end, I didn't just turn the tables, I walked away from the game entirely, finally free.